And we are live.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Kane, Director of Services for Community Action Partnership of Sonoma County, and tonight's panel moderator. We're excited to bring you tonight's discussion that focuses on the harmful effects of whitewashing history, how it creates false narratives, and what reparations may or could look like to move forward and heal. We are joined by tonight's panel of Tanya Forsberg, Rose Hammock, and Tasha Fridia. I'll have each of them give you a brief bio about themselves. We'll move into discussion, and then if there's time at the end, we will open for questions. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Rose to open our session with a land acknowledgement.
Shinta, how are you, everyone? Just to give a formal land acknowledgement here in Sonoma County, I want to give an offering of prayer and blessing and just speaking these people into existence. This is for the past ancestors, the current relatives that live on this land, and for the future generations of the Southern Pomo, Coast Miwok, and Wapo people of all of Sonoma County. And we want to give recognition to all of the people that are still here today. And just a reminder, to be thoughtful of where you are and be thoughtful of the people's land that we all occupy here today. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Rose. Rose, can you just go ahead and start and just give a brief bio of yourself?
There we go. Yes, so again, my name is Rose Hammock. I shared a little bit of language there. Chintae is our way of greeting, saying, how are you in the Eastern Pomo dialect. My people come from Round Valley and Big Valley, which are two Northern California tribes here. And I live here within Sonoma County, and I consider myself a community educator going into our schools and going with other different organizations to bring awareness and bring teachings of our Pomo culture and our Native American ways here. And I'm very grateful to be here for a third time. And I hope you all enjoy our discussion here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. And Tanya?
Hi, am I muted? Okay, yes. Hi, my name is Tanya Forsberg, and this is my third community conversation on race. I am connected to Sonoma through my family. My husband was born and raised in Santa Rosa, and my in-laws, and I have lots and lots of friends still in Sonoma. I live here in San Leandro, and I consider myself to be just, a regular person, a typical person. I have some activist, inclinations, but, I really think that, my voice is here to represent a person who is interested in, in understanding more about the society and the culture that we live in, and hoping to educate people as well through my, through my own knowledge, and hoping to educate and continuing always to educate myself.
Okay, thank you. And Tasha?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tasha Fridia. I am Wichita, Kiowa, and Caddo, also Hunka Oglala Lakota, from Oklahoma, which is the homelands of my people, my Gidgadish people. I'm really happy and honored to sit on this panel today and have this discussion with you all. It's my third time back as well with the community conversations on race. In my professional background, I am the Assistant Director of the Tribal Youth Resource Center and working for justice and healing and wellness for Indigenous youth all over Indian country. So very nice to be with you and have this conversation. And thank you for everyone who's taking the time to join and learn and improve kind of what Tanya was alluding to, just bettering ourselves as human beings. So thank you, Sutits.
Thank you. So I'd like to just go over some key definitions around tonight's discussion. So we'll start with you, Tanya. Can you give us just a brief definition of critical race theory? And you're on mute, Tanya.
Thank you. Okay, so just to be clear, Although I'm giving this definition of critical race theory, tonight's discussion is not about that. So one of the reasons why we want to give this definition is to help people understand what critical race theory actually is and why we're not discussing critical race. Just because you're discussing something about race does not put it into the category of critical race theory, which is how it's being positioned by people with an agenda to stifle these kinds of conversations. So critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States that seeks to critically examine US law as it intersects with issues of race in the US and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. CRT examines social, cultural, and legal issues primarily as they relate to race and racism in the United States. And so it is something that is taught in law school. It is something that that is not, it's something that's very subtle. It is definitely not taught in schools. In grammar school or in high school, it's really about, thinking about how racism and disparate outcomes are, they're outcomes that are a part of a complex, subtle dynamics rather than this sort of explicit focus on, well, somebody's burning a cross on your front lawn, or someone doesn't want Black people to come to their school, right? That is not critical race theory. It is very, very different from what you are hearing about. So I just want to use this as a sort of a framework for what we are not going to talk about tonight.
Great, thank you. And Tasha, can you give us a little bit history on, the whitewashing of history and some examples of that?
Sure. So I too was like, law trained. So I was like, let me look up, what the official definition is, kind of Webster's. And it says to gloss over or cover up vices, crimes, or scandals, or to exonerate by means of a perfunctory investigation or biased presentation of data. And I think when we're looking at data, we're talking about all sorts of information, right? And so really, to me, it's the intersection of white supremacy, culture, and storytelling, and how all of those meet and create this other narrative or perspective of that kind of supersedes the truth and the facts. And so I know that our definitions are supposed to be brief, but I think that's a good foundational piece. And I think throughout this conversation, we'll talk about, because many different examples of how this is present in our everyday lives, from entertainment to religion. It's everywhere. It's just that we're not, most people are not aware of it or aware enough to look for it and identify it. So hopefully after this, we can create some of those skills within our community.
Great, thank you. And Rose, reparations.
So again, there are different ideas around what reparations are, but a kind of a formal definition is the making of amends for a wrong one has done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. And I think an example of some reparations that are happening, not just in our area here of Sonoma County, but areas all around, is what are called land acknowledgements. And we'll talk about that later in this conversation a little bit, but it's just making that first step, that first little bit of effort to try to make amends, try to repair something that has happened within history, within relationships, within something that's happened within the community. So we look forward to touching on that a little bit.
Great, thank you. So now we'll just kind of dive into some of our questions that we have prepared. So Rose, at our prep meeting, you said something really impactful. You said, if we want our stories to be told, we have to tell them ourselves. So I would love it if each of you could share an event in history that has whitewashed or erased or falsely depicted that directly affected you or your family, your people. So Rose, can we start with you?
Yeah, so, during that prep meeting, I was thinking about all sorts of things that we could talk about that happened within our Native community. Here in Sonoma County, we have a really large population of Native people, and not only in our area of Northern California, but in places such as Canada, we're starting to hear a lot of news around boarding schools. And anyone out there listening who's not familiar, please do your research. Look into what the boarding schools have done and continue to do within history. And the reason I say continue is not because boarding schools is still active and we have people within boarding schools, how our ancestors were in boarding schools. But I bring up that fact because we have a saying that we carry a lot of intergenerational trauma or generational trauma. You know, I carry trauma from my ancestors from a long time ago. And, you know, unknowingly, that trauma gets passed down through us, through things like the boarding schools, you know, the abuse, the neglect, the wrongdoings that happen. And if you look up some of the things that are being talked about around boarding schools now, especially those boarding schools being investigated and the land is being dug up in different areas of Canada, is that remains of Native children who attended those boarding schools, remains are being found on boarding school grounds. So no school in the past, the present, the future should have a graveyard, but a lot of these boarding schools have those graveyards. And some of those boarding schools that have been taken down or may have been boarded up, whatever that situation may be, those young spirits of those someone's ancestors, someone's great grandmas and great grandpas, their spirits are at an unrest. And so we see reparation from some of the Native communities there, holding dances and holding gatherings to try and repair what has been done in those places. And, you know, with the first few boarding schools that have been investigated, there's over 1,500 remains, 1,500 remains plus of Native children, real Native children. You know, this isn't just fake news that we see every now and then. This is a real harsh piece of Native history that a lot of people are not aware of. And so, you know, having platforms such as this and having news coverages in different areas of Canada is really starting to open people's minds and open people's hearts to things that are, like I said, a harsh piece of our history. But you know, although we've seen a really harsh piece of what boarding schools have done, we're seeing the beautiful things coming out of it, bringing communities together, and hopefully we can see some of those remains going back to their homelands and having ceremonies done for those families. So, you know, a part of reparation has to happen within ourselves as well. And that's why I like to encourage everyone to do their research. And hopefully, you know, throughout this conversation, we'll be dropping some links and different information for you all to kind of do your own research. But that's one piece of how we decolonize ourselves and how we can do those reparations within ourselves and within our families, is to educate ourselves and to recognize that, you know, there's parts of our own history that we need to look back into and raise awareness and help all of our community. So it's not just the Native community that needs to become aware of things like the boarding schools and the other things that we're going to hear about in just a minute. We all need to wake up to what's going on, and together we're making those reparations that need to happen.
So that's amazing that Rose has brought up the boarding school issue. You know, this is something, as she said, all across Turtle Island that our people are experiencing. And in bringing back our relatives, our young relatives that have been in these unmarked graves, you know, I think the general population thinks, oh, boarding school, that has a different connotation to mainstream society, a good education, all of these things. But it's important to note that these were essentially concentration camps and prisons for babies that were stolen from their parents and their families and their homelands. And then some of them lost their lives due to abuse, brokenheartedness, all of these things, and were buried in unmarked graves and tossed aside as if they were nothing. And tomorrow I leave on a trip with the Oglala Sioux tribe, where I serve as a policy advisor. It's another job that I do. But we are going with our relatives from the Rosebud Sioux tribe to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which in America is one of the epicenters of the boarding school atrocities that happen to our people. And we are going to a disinterment ceremony where they're going to get some of their young relatives and take them home and have those ceremonies that Rose is talking about. My great-great-grandmother on my Wichita side was a student there. And so it's that intergenerational trauma that she talks about is a very real thing. So in a weird way, I'm excited to go because I can touch the land that my great-great-grandma was on, but she experienced such trauma there. She lived, but she experienced such trauma, and we continue to carry these on with our families. In the Department of Interior, Secretary Holland, who's the first Native American woman or Native American to hold that position, will be there as well. And she's really making some strides for this issue among Indian country. But as Rose said, this is something that we all need to understand. And that's why I just wanted to share a little bit. So thank you for giving me that time.
Thanks, Tasha. And Tasha, is there anything else, like, you can give examples of laws that have been affected by this?
Sure. I think if we look at the history of this country, essentially every law that's ever been passed in history has had an impact on whitewashing history. When I was preparing for this panel, I really wanted to be specific and intentional about acknowledging that you all are in California. UC Berkeley did a study about the exclusion of African Americans and Latina people among jury pools, and the impact that has on individuals who are being prosecuted, and the way that for a long period of time, the way that was done was really by these. When you're choosing the jury pool, you do get the option to just throw out several jurors, so many jurors for no reason at all. You don't have to have an explanation, and that how the bias that people have prosecutorially and all of these things definitely plays in. And then as we look, not only probably in California, but nationwide, people of color are highly represented in the correctional facilities charged and all of that. And so that's one issue specific to California. There's a massive study about that and how that they're using the legal system to perpetuate the whitewashing of justice, if you will.
Mhm.
And so I know we're trying to stay on time, so I won't go any further, but super, super interesting in the ways that in which these are done. And we look at, Native Americans weren't even citizens until 1924. And so looking at that community, how were they ever going to be included on juries? So lots to dig into there, but just a tidbit.
And Tanya.
Yeah, this is so interesting, and we could really spend many, many hours having discussions about this. I do think that, what's interesting to me, and I want to talk specifically about, something that I think, a topic that is top of mind for many people that may be on this, listening to this today. And, it's the Tulsa massacre. And what I find interesting, what I know about the Tulsa massacre is it's not that much. It's not that much, to be honest, because the people who were involved with it, Black people in particular, were silenced. So that they knew that if they spoke about it or talked too much about it, that maybe it would happen again. And I think it was made very clear to them that that's what would happen, that it could happen once and it could happen again. I do know, obviously I never learned about Tulsa at school, something, this huge event where basically Americans bombed other Americans and destroyed entyre neighborhood. But what I do know is that my father's father left Oklahoma in the 1920s, and his family left everything that they had there. They'd been there for probably 50 or 60 years. His ancestor actually is Bass Reeves, who was the first Black U.S. Marshal. And so they had roots there. But in the 1920s, mysteriously, they all just left. They just left everything and just came to Chicago, left everything that they had there. And, you know, clearly that changed the historical trajectory of the family by that, leaving. And there were lots of people who left at that time. There is an excellent, there have been a couple of excellent depictions of what it must have been like that day and during that time for the Tulsans. I also know that my dad had cousins who owned a junkyard, a profitable junkyard in Arkansas, which is adjacent to Oklahoma. And around that time, their junkyard was, because they refused to sell, was burned with everyone in it, and they all died. And this is something that I just, my dad never told me this. His dad never really talked that much about Oklahoma or Tulsa. And we didn't learn about it at school. And when you don't, the way that Tulsa was deliberately whitewashed, and I think we have to be really clear here, this was not an accident. It was deliberately done so that people wouldn't, whatever justice there might have been, I don't know what justice there would have been for the white Tulsans who perpetrated this, but it was, the microfiche, the articles were cut so that it wouldn't be in the microfiche when you went to the library. Obviously, Black citizens were threatened. So, that whitewashing of history is, it directly affected my family and affects us to this day. And honestly, one other thing I want to say is I loved that, that Rose mentioned reparations within ourselves, because I truly believe that the violence, I believe in karma, I believe in energy, and I truly believe that the violence that was perpetrated in this country, the beginning of this country and throughout its history, that is there. It does not disappear, and it manifests in so many ways. And we're going to talk about that later, but it has not gone away, and it continues to fester in the soul of our country. And we wonder why things are wrong and why things, aren't working properly and why there's so much dysfunction, and absolutely pretending like the history isn't what it is damaging to our country.
Well, and that's a good segue into our next question, as far as how does this erasure of history, this creating these false narratives, have an effect on everyone, including white people? So I'm going to go back to you, Tanya.
Okay, thank you. Gosh, there's so many, when I think about the narratives, I think it's, the narrative, the history has been whitewashed to suit a specific narrative in this country, to suit many specific narratives. The narrative of a meritocracy, the narrative of a liberal democracy, the narrative of white supremacy, honestly, right? And when I think about, I think it's pretty clear how that hurts non-white people. But when you think about, all of that dysfunction and how you can relate so much of it back to this whitewashing of history, these creating these false, just absolutely false narratives around what has happened in the past, calling plantations instead of forced labor camps, which is what they are, or boarding schools for that matter. That's whitewashing a term, right? That's not, they were concentration camps. Let's call them what they were. When you do this, you create within, I think, the white community, a narrative of maybe whiteness as their only, as somebody's only value in the world, rather than, other things about them that might also be valuable. But, the whiteness is just front and center as the reason why they should be receiving these certain things, or why don't I have this or that? I might be the, so I think that, I think that's a piece of it. I also think this whole issue around guilt is a piece of it. And then there are very specific things like, why do we have a national, our national healthcare system could be better. It could be way better. Everyone is involved with that. Everyone, there's a reason, the whitewashing of history has contributed to us having the healthcare system that we have, and white people have died because of our terrible health system. There are so many, there's a list of things I could say about why it hurts, why this hurts everyone. And
you talked even about just, the massacre where the insurance companies called it a riot, so they wouldn't have to pay Black businesses.
You're right.
That changing of a word, to make it something else. Exactly.
So there's just, and again, I do have to go back to, I'm not a religious person, but like I said, I really do believe in energy. And I do believe that, it's just this festering sore that is sitting on our conscience, our nation's conscience. And there are some things that you can't go around. You just have to go through it. You have to just do the work. And this false historical narrative prevents us from doing the work that we need to do as a country so that we can move on to the bigger issues that, not this false, this definition of race or whatever this is, right? Let's focus on the things that we all have in common as humans. And it keeps us from doing that.
Tasha.
Sure, thank you. I think, to reiterate what we've all said is that words have meaning, right? And that language matters. And in changing that language, we change the narrative and our understanding collectively and all of those things. And so I don't think any of us would disagree that whitewashing of history affects everyone. I would say, in my opinion, that there are two major groups that it affects more than others. And that's really, I think it affects white people more than it affects us, because they're living in blissful ignorance. And when we live in that way, we have no opportunity for growth or true understanding, that introspection and reflection that Tanya is talking about. And so we can't grow from that. And so I think it definitely impacts them a lot. And I think young children, and Tanya mentioned too earlier that we're not learning a lot of things in grammar school and things like that. I was fortunate enough to be raised by my grandmother, who I think I mentioned on a previous thing that we did, colored all the people in my books brown and made them have black hair. And I had brown Barbies when they were available. I didn't have any, I had things in people that looked like me. And so really instilling identity, because the intergenerational trauma that Rose talked about, it definitely exists, right? But also there's the flip side of that. The women that sit here on this panel, we are representations of the strength and resilience of all of our people. We come from the strongest of all of our ancestors because we've all endured so much to sit here today. And so I think we have to feed that narrative to the future generations. We have to take the time, which I feel like a lot of people of color do, and because we have to, is teach the true histories at home, because people aren't learning it in grammar schools, and they're not learning it. And some people aren't open to it, right? Because then they're racist. And we see that when we're talking about Oklahoma, which is my home state. And they are, we passed a law that we can't teach things in school that make people uncomfortable because they feel like they're racist. The truth is the truth. We can put a bow on it. We can do whatever we want to it, but the truth is still going to be the truth. And we have to create spaces where our children can learn that, or it doesn't change.
Yeah, and it goes to really, we talked about a little bit in prep, is that internal silencing. It's the dangers for children growing up not knowing, true history, that turn into adults who don't know and don't believe this history. So again, like you said, perfect example we talked about is, the missions and the projects we get in kindergarten to do missions. And I remember coming home and my mom telling me, well, let me tell you about what it really was. And this is your great, great, great grandmother who, ended up in a mission, and, all the things that happened to them, and really essentially being slaves. So, it's those types of things that you don't hear and don't get taught that just, again, perpetuate that.
Can I just say one thing as well? You know, I think really, Tasha, when you mentioned like that there are actual laws about feelings, like people feeling a certain way. And I think it's so important for us to really examine that there could even be a law written that basically stifles conversation because somebody's feelings might be hurt. You know, I remember so clearly the dreaded family tree assignment that all Black children have to go through, where you get to like this very certain point, I'd say great grandparents, you know, and if you're lucky, great grandparents. And then after that, it's just like a cloud. It's just like an opaque cloud of people you know existed, but you literally know nothing about them. Why? Because they were enslaved. There's only so much, and then then you would come in with your unfinished tree, and all of the little white children would have this tree that went all the way back, you know, to the 1600s in some specific country, and then on top of it, maybe the teacher would ask, "Oh, well, let's make a. Why don't you make a? You know, make something. Why don't we? What food is from your country?" And all you can say is Africa. And I definitely had a feeling about that. It was not a good feeling. Should we not have any more family tree, you know, assignments in school because Black children will feel a way about not having a complete family tree? It's a question.
Right. And so I have two teenage daughters, and when they were in elementary school, I'm that mom, right? I've taught them that everything is a teachable moment. And while it shouldn't be their responsibility to teach everyone, if they know, they need to speak up. And so my baby was doing a family tree. And at some point I told her to put slave, slave, slave. And they had to have the conversation in class at that point. And she's probably like 8, right? But she can hold her own. And I think it's important. We cannot forget that happened. I mean, we just cannot. And so I think, you know, for our white allies, those are things that they can think about, right? And how we can have those conversations and really try to come to an understanding of what everyone else's experience is. We can't live in a bubble, and we have to see beyond self.
Yeah, and just to go to Rose, but there's just a comment and a question that came in, you know, how do we teach history related to slavery when government is dictating what we can or cannot be taught? And I think you guys kind of answered that, because it's really up to us. And like Rose said, it's up to us to tell our stories. So I think that's really what it is we have to be the ones to change that narrative for ourselves, for our children, for, you know, those that we know. So Rose, I'm going to have you join in.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, to keep repeating it, we're storytellers, you know, no matter whether we're children or elders, because we always have a story to tell, whether it's about our family, our culture, our traditions. And I think for myself, I noticed really early on, I never had a Native staff person at my elementary, at my middle school, at my high school. And it pushed me to help kind of reinstate the Native clubs that were at my high school and my junior college. And it was a way to give other Native people a voice on campus for us to find each other and to help each other tell our stories. And I think, you know, when it goes to, you know, how do all these things go to the erasure of history and creating these false narratives, you know, it took us a while to just like, even as far as like getting scholarships at college, like as a Native person, not all of us are fortunate enough to come from you know, a reservation or you know, a tribe that is able to give us per cap, you know, that supplemental money. You know, not all of us get support to go to school. Not all of us get support every month or however that tribe specifically does their per cap, you know. And I'm one of those people who come from a fairly large tribe. Round Valley, we have a little over 5,000 tribal members. And so, you know, when it came to me going to college, yes, our tribe offered a scholarship, but when you're going to college, you know, you have your books, your classes, you have to worry about transportation, and that's every semester, you know, or you're trying to think ahead for a whole year. So narratives such as saying all Native people get money from the government, or, oh, you have a casino for your tribe, you must get all kinds of money. that's a narrative that we have to break down for people, that we pay taxes just like everybody else. We have to work 2 or 3 jobs to put ourselves through education and try to strive just like everyone else, you know. And I think if we go a little further as far as, you know, the boarding schools and the missions, just how you were saying, Kathy, the missions and the boarding schools together were not these happy places. You know, these white people who basically owned the native people as slaves and tortured them to build that mission that we see today, that's not a good relationship, you know. And what are the reparations that we need to do? And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit at the end of our conversation, but I just want to throw it out there now that anyone out there that is within the Sacramento area, we are going to be meeting to support AB 338, and it's to keep the Junipero Serra statue down. So we're going to be meeting this Wednesday at the California State Capitol. And so that's one way that not only us as the Native community, but all people can come out and be a part of that reparation, support the Native community, and just show up. You know, these are things that, you know, why should we have a statue of a person who raped and beat Native people and then other indigenous people? And there's statues like that all throughout California and many other states. That's one way of reparation, is keeping those statues out of the light and replacing them, hopefully, with our Native leaders or our indigenous leaders or leaders of color that we're supporting those movements. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I think as far as, you know, white allies, other allies of color, we all need to do our part to educate ourselves and educate the young people. And, you know, sometimes those conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but unless we take that step, like I said before, we have to tell our story. You know, we can't rely on white people to tell our history and to tell our story. And even if they do have a little bit of our stories and history, that's not saying that they're going to tell the truth. So if we want that real truth, that real piece of history, allow us to have that voice to share it out to the community and to our schools. Put ourselves into the school systems and into organizations and other places that we need to take those spaces, and we need to educate everyone.
Great, thank you. So I want to touch on this next question really kind of briefly, because I do want to get to a little bit more of the reparations discussion. I know we are time limited, but on January 6th, we witnessed a violent attack on our democracy as supporters of our previous president stormed the Capitol. It's now July 6th, 6 months later, and we've seen very little action taken and the beginning of a whitewashing of this event. So can we talk about this a little bit? So I'm going to start with you, Tasha.
Sure. I don't think, as a person of color, as a woman, as someone who enjoys the political system, that I'm at all surprised that we haven't seen any movement since the insurrection, right? And that we have started to see that being whitewashed. You know, when we look at that incident, they injured over 140 members of law enforcement. And this is the same group that is always like, Blue Lives Matter, until they don't, right? And so, you know, we've seen them depicted in the news as like peaceful patriots walking in an orderly fashion between the velvet ropes. And that, I mean, it just takes 2 eyes and a couple of brain cells to watch any of that footage and be like, that's not what happened, right? But, you know, some people put their blinders on and their neurons aren't firing just quite right. And so they will believe whatever is, you know, fed to them, and they will regurgitate that. And the more it goes, it's kind of like the telephone game, right? And that becomes reality to some folks. And I think, you know, historically, we have seen this kind of deflect, minimize, deny. And that, I mean, that's what they're doing now, but they've done that forever, right? I mean, on all sorts of issues, all the issues that we've touched on. So again, not surprised. I think we see that with the pandemic. And the facts that surround vaccination and transmission and all of those things. So we're dealing with some really important issues as a country, and having these false narratives and the whitewashing and the just, you know, inability to receive facts is definitely detrimental to the entire United States.
Great, thanks. And Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right, to see this happening in real time. We all know what happened on January 6th, right? But, I think the jury is still out on what the history of January 6th will be. There is a movement in an anti-democratic movement, a strong anti-democratic movement in this country. And the whitewashing of January 6th is part of that movement. It's being used, the big lie that drove the events of January 6th, that's being used to curtail voting rights for all people, even though, there are certain groups that will be disproportionately affected by these new laws. But all people are going to be affected by this. I think if you went out and asked most people, do they want to live under a one-party rule? Do they want to live under authoritarian regime? I think most people would say no, including most white people. I think about, the fact that that this is something that, if we can talk and help educate people to understand that this is part of a process that is ongoing and has happened throughout our history. And it allowed people to see that this is something that, there are people with an agenda, and that they are fulfilling the agenda by trying to whitewash the events of January 6th, as other events have been whitewashed throughout history. I mean, maybe we'll have a chance. I think the jury is still out, though, regarding the impact that this will have. And then, again, going back to, the pandemic and vaccinations and all those things, like all of that is part of a sort of a package right now that's really about, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, even though people aren't necessarily saying it out loud, but at least it seems to me that there is a strong anti-democratic movement, and that it's possible that within the next few years, we might see, it's possible that we might see things happening in America that we just did not think were possible. We should be very open-minded when it comes to what is possible in this country. And, at the end of the day, Black and brown people have been under an authoritarian rule. Black and brown people have been disappeared in the middle of the night. We think these things can't happen in America, but Black and brown people have experienced this again, throughout our history. We've been silenced, we've been tortured, we've been, we've been terrorized. And that is not part of our narrative, the general narrative in America.
And Rose, jump in.
Just looking at time too, in all honesty, I don't have too much more to add. I just think, as far as little action being taken, I think there's so many events that have happened, within the last 10, 15 years, even, again, a totally different conversation, but even looking at interactions as far as like police brutality throughout all groups with colored people, that's a very tiptoe subject, if you want to say. And I think as far as, little action, it goes back to things just being completely washed over. Something is, in the limelight for a few months and then it kind of drops off and is forgotten about. But, things that have to do with our lives as people of color, we have to stay on top of it. And again, we have to be the ones that continue to bring it to the light, to keep people's attention on it until something is done about it. And we can't always rely on those, I guess, people of power, if you want to say it, to be our voice. We have to continue to collect with one another and find a way to uplift one another's voice so we don't get forgotten and that these important things don't get washed over, because a lot of our history as colored people throughout history, in the past, in the present, and probably in the future, things will continue to be washed over. But I think the more we stay on top of it, we're going to keep those things in the light, and hopefully we'll see some kind of justice come to it.
Thank you. So Rose, I'm going to just have you stay, you're going to start the next question off, but talking about reparations, what does this look like for you? What needs to happen? And, I know you had made a mention even when in our previous discussions that, when you look at what people think are reparations, for instance, them giving you back land, but the land was without water, without, good soil. So what kind of reparation is that truly? So what does this look like for you?
I think, I want to take a step back for a second and just think reparations as far as like our education, going to things as such. I believe it's the 4th grade that they start introducing the mission system. If you go, and this is a local organization here called the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center, CIMCC for short. They have all kinds of great resources on their website that talk about, what are alternatives to that project. Maybe teachers take a step and say, well, here in Santa Rosa, for example, from our area all the way to Bodega Bay is many different tribal territories. Maybe instead of learning about a mission and learning about what happened, maybe you're assigned, the people, the Coast Miwok people from Great and Rancheria, looking into their tribal history, looking at their tribal lands, and finding ways that we can focus and uplift those certain communities. I think as far as just having Native staff people, having more Native people in our communities stepping up and furthering their education to become educators and to become these teachers. And, myself included, only having my associates for teaching, I still find ways to get into our school systems in our area to work with some of our students that are in continuation schools and in elementary schools, and doing small presentations talking about our culture, bringing my family and sharing our traditional dance in the schools, because that's just as powerful, raising that awareness that, all throughout history, Native people are extinct and Native people don't exist. We're here, we exist, and we still practice our traditional ways. A lot of us traditional dance, we basket weave, we travel to ceremony, and so many other things. We have, Native people in politics. We have Native doctors and nurses and lawyers. And I think it's, the focus that we have on the negative things in our history, we need to put as much focus on the positive things that we're creating. And again, that goes to all of our people of color. People are so quick to be drawn to that negative that's going on in our communities, but there's so much positive that is happening too. And we need to focus on both of those equally. How can we make reparations from the bad that is happening in our communities and creating good out of it? And I think the last thing I'll just add is, again, finding ways that you can be involved in communities. If there's a march or a rally, or, someone needs volunteers to help with something, these are all different ways that you can be a part of the community and help. Because unless you put yourself in our community and bring yourself to these events, you can't just stand in the far back up in the nosebleeds and expect to, be an ally, and I think even looking at what does it mean to be a real ally, are you coming to our events and you're standing with us and supporting us? Or are you just sharing something once on social media and, yeah, I support? Just remember that we're not a box to be checked off. If you're really about being a support, being a true ally, you'll find a way to come and support in whatever way that you can. And I think, that goes for us as well, for all of our communities. It's about uplifting one another and helping each other raise a voice. If their voice isn't being heard, I'll help be that voice for that person, and so on. That's how we uplift one another. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. And that actually kind of gives me back to something that Tanya had said, that you can't be in the middle. You know, you're either racist or you're not. You can't pick one thing and not pick the rest. So Tanya, I'll have you lead off.
Yeah, I think it was from Ibram Kendi. You're either racist or anti-racist. There's no middle ground here. And when I think about reparations, I really love Rose's focus on community and giving back in that way. And I think that is definitely part of it. I think it's complex, right? Because honestly, how could you really, repay what has happened? There is that part of it, right? What is it worth? So there's lots and lots of research that has been done, a lot of think tanks who have thoughts about what reparations could look like. We've paid reparations in the past. We paid reparations to the Japanese who were in internment camps and to their descendants if the people who had been in the internment camps had passed away before they could get reparations. And I think, for Black people, and I'm not speaking for all Black people, I'm speaking, this is my opinion of what I think reparations would look like for Black Americans. I think there are two sort of pieces to it. One, I think, is an actual monetary amount. When you look at the gap between the wealth of a typical white family and the wealth of a Black family, it's something like white families have 17 times. I'm not saying all, this is a generalization, but if you look at all white families and you average it out, they've got a net worth of about $171,000. And when you take all the Black families, it's something like 17,000. And I believe that, when you think about all of the 250 years of stolen labor, that there should be some kind of payment for it. And there actually was, I think General Sherman actually did give descendants of slaves in certain states 40 acres and a mule. That was the land of the slave owners, and it could have been done then. That could have been reparations. Only Andrew Johnson became president, and he was a Southern sympathizer, and he rescinded all that. And he not only took away took the land back and gave it back to the previous slave owners, but those slave owners previously had gotten like $300 for every, for their lost property, for each piece of lost property, right? And so the enslaved people didn't get anything. And so it could have been done, and it wasn't. So I think there's a monetary piece to this. And then I think there is also, there are laws and policies in place that are hurting Black and brown people today, and they need to be looked at. We could have a whole conversation on reparations alone and what that looks like. But I think there are two different sides. There is a great a group called the African Descendants of Slaves, which I'll put in our in the link at the bottom of our conversation. And they actually have a very detailed detailed write-up about what they think reparations looks like specifically for descendants of enslaved people, and then also for the Black community at large, which still, whether you're from Jamaica or from, an African immigrant, you're coming here and you're experiencing life as a Black American and all of the racial issues that come with that. So I think there are two sides to that.
Yeah. And Tasha.
Sure. So I kind of want to touch on where Tanya left off with kind of the African American experience of what reparations are. I think generally for me, across all the groups that I represent, just acknowledgement, right? Acknowledgement of what has occurred and what is continuing to occur goes a long way. It's validating. It's empowering for people of color, for others to recognize what has happened. But speaking, generally towards African American experience, I think there's a quote that I like, and it's anonymous, and it says, "By our unpaid labor and suffering, we have earned the right to the soil many times over and over, and now we are determined to have it." And so I think that's really indicative of, a lot of times within Native communities, we talk about our ancestral lands and the blood of our ancestors is in the land. The same thing goes for my African American ancestors. Their blood is in the land, whether they were killed, whether it's from picking cotton, whatever it is, we're trying to escape. The blood is in the land, and so we have to acknowledge that. And, you know, I think Tanya touched on it. You know, 40 acres and a mule would be great. Some monetary amount might be great. If to me, it's symbolic. There isn't, and Rose touched on this too. There isn't any amount of money that you could give to me that would pay for the suffering of my ancestors, that would pay for the whitewashing of history that has gone on and continues to go on. You cannot monetize dignity and humanity. That just can't happen. But you can acknowledge, right? You can acknowledge, and you can do some symbolic things that will help with the healing process. Also do agree with Rose that investing in our youth and future generations, because that's what was stolen from us, our future to be who we are, whether that is as an African from whatever country, the unknown countries that Tanya and I don't know where our ancestors came from because they were brought here, or whether that is from, you know, this red quarter of Mother Earth that they call Turtle Island. You know, our future potential as people of color and cultural people was stolen from us. So at the very least, now that we live in this modern Western world, give us a future where we can earn and we can create intergenerational wealth, and we can have strong families, right? So that's through education. You know, give me my culture back, give me my spirituality back, invest in those things, right? So those are the types of reparation that have any meaning or matter, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. So in our last 5 minutes, there's a question that came in. Do you think an empirical study looking at beliefs about law enforcement and inappropriate use of force might help citizens, law enforcement agencies, and oversight committees? That is providing data that is studies by social scientists. So, Tasha.
Do you mind if I jump in? I think, and I hate to be just very skeptical, but and data is important, but we also have to have people who are willing to accept it. And we talked about that when we're talking about the insurrection and the pandemic. We could do any number of studies and show empirically that this exists. This is a problem. Police brutality, racial bias, all of these things. People have to be ready to receive that and also act on that, because then we have a beautiful paperweight. Even if people are willing to acknowledge that that is an issue, then what are we then going to do about it? And as Rose mentioned, it takes all of us, right, to figure out how we move that forward. And I would say, you know, all of these are overwhelming problems that did not occur in a vacuum or overnight. And it's going to take probably twice as long to dismantle these types of issues, but it starts at the individual level. So people who are here listening to this and took the time to do it, that's where it starts, right? People who take the time to educate themselves and then educate their families, then we educate our communities. So it's a long road for sure. And I think that data collection and studies is just one small portion of it.
Thanks. Anybody else want to?
Well, you know, I do want to, I think, you know, I think Tasha had said everything really well there. You know, but what I liked about her comment was when she referred to educating ourselves. I really, it's clear that there's a great fear amongst the right about the education of white America, you know, regarding our history, right? Because that's really who they are trying to protect with this whitewashing of history. You know, we all know, you know, most of us know, we may not know all of it and all of the details, but in our families, we absolutely, you know, I've had conversations from when I was very little about, you know, about what really happened. I think it's really important, you know, when you go back to even trying to have, you know, empirical studies and all of this data, we have this data. We have a lot of data. We have data that shows that that vaccinations work, but there are still millions of people who won't get a vaccination. You know, you can have all that data and not have any movement whatsoever. We saw what happened on January 6th. We watched it live, and yet there is a very strong narrative that that's not what happened. So data can only take you so far.
Thank you. So with that being said, I just want to thank you all for being here, for sharing the space, for sharing your knowledge and continuing to educate people out there every day, starting from those closest to you to all the people watching on here. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And I just want to remind our audience that our community conversations on race are continuing, and we will continue to have these important conversations. You can also go back to our Facebook Live page and look at all of our past discussions. So we thank you all for being here tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Sudeeps, thank you guys.
Bye.